Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you first, Muhammad, for the gracious introduction and also for the hospitality. Muhammad, Tamanna, and Basil. Really appreciated just having the opportunity to join you all tonight. So like Muhammad introduced, the conversation is going to be about primarily Qur'an manuscripts that have origins in West and Central Africa, and how you can find them in their experience in different archives, and what this archival experience can do for us as we think about the journey of the sacred text. So I'm kind of breaking the conversation into three sections or parts. We'll kind of pause in between to give us an opportunity to engage and reflect on some parts of it, but also to make it manageable. So we'll start with some of the backstory, a little bit of a story to connect a manuscript that's going to be a central feature here to some of the research that I've been doing. Because I think it is good sometimes to connect with your work and to have a story that connects you. So we'll start with the backstory. So when I mentioned this idea of the archive, archives themselves are created things. They have their own ambiguities and journeys. Oftentimes when they're in places not where the manuscripts or texts are located, those histories can be complex and have ambiguity. And that's something that we're going to look at in this beginning portion now. And when I say the book, in quotes, the book refers to the Qur'an. And if we look at the second ayah of the second surah of the Qur'an, the Qur'an is referring to itself as a book from the very outset of the Qur'an, a book in which there's no doubt. So it's worthwhile to consider that for many, upwards of 1.5 billion people around the world, the book, in a way, refers to the Qur'an. And so it's one way of thinking and reflecting on these texts when they're in these archives, and also just in our daily practice and experience. So this is the one that I mentioned is where there's a personal connection, and there's been a central artifact in my research. So I did my undergraduate and master's. There was a big gap in between at the University of Michigan in the United States. And when I returned to the university for my master's, I also happened to work for our Islamic studies curriculum. Just before I started actually trying to learn Arabic. It wasn't until I was in my 20s that I actually started to learn. So before I could properly read under my alphabet, could pronounce some vowels, we stumbled upon something that seemed kind of nondescript as we're moving offices. So this was like our Center for Middle East Studies, our Islamic studies. We moved from one building to another. And there was just folio sitting on an office in a back corner, just laying there. It looked very nondescript. It seemed this can't be anything important. It wouldn't just be sitting here amongst a bunch of files and old papers. So I saw it, noticed it, and was like, I think that's Arabic, but it can't be of significance. Didn't pay it any mind. A week later, returned with a colleague. She got in touch with our manuscripts librarian, and come to find out, it's a 19th century Qur'an from West Africa, from one of the most ancient sites of manuscript production in West Africa, near the Lake Chad region. So it was of substantial importance, and we didn't realize it. It was just kind of tucked away in the corner of a back office, not cataloged. So the story is not really known. So this is the short story to show you the connection. So this, in some way, inspired me to hurry up and start working on my Arabic so I can engage with this text. So the things I wanted to point out very quickly is, if you look, this is different than the way we receive the Qur'an in many ways. The carrying case, the wrapper, and if you'll notice, if any of you are familiar with the manuscript traditions of West Africa, Qur'ans are characteristically unbound. So there's no binding that formally keeps the pages together. It's single leaf folios all the way through. So when you open up, leather wrapper, usually goat skin, you have a leather strap, ties it closed, cowrie shell for ornamentation, but the individual pages are loose. What does this facilitate? Well, it facilitates memorization, study. You can take your pages as you need them to memorize Qur'an. It also facilitates khatam Qur'an groups, where folks can take their pages. You have a group in a setting together reviewing. You have your hizb of Qur'an, someone else has theirs, and it facilitates recitation in a collective way, right? This is a part of the practice of this region. And so I'm showing you the first two pages here because we have Fatiha and Baqarah, and a small thing that we'll get to later. I want us to just notice there's a slight difference here in even the way the title is indicated for Surah Fatiha. So it says Surah Fatiha al-Kitab. It's a small change, but it demonstrates an important feature that some of us are probably familiar with, most of us. The titles for surahs are not fixed. Their standardization didn't actually come until 1923 with the Royal Qur'an. So this idea that there's titles, there's multiple potential names for titles is something is clear. If you are familiar with the Birmingham Qur'an, there's no surah titles. Those earliest manuscripts, it's just the mutton, it's just the body of the text. Surah titles are actually more representative of local practices in a particular region. The Qur'ans we have today represent the kind of broader practice of printing and printing of text, so you see something of a shift in time. The content itself, the actual text, it's the same. But you do see variation in the manuscript traditions and the manuscript cultures and the way in which the Qur'an is transmitted and the way in which even you can get a sense of interpretation from the way in which surah titles are transmitted. And so for Qur'ans that are produced in this region, it's quite frequent to see the titles actually be Surah Al-Kitab. And I'll get to that more later in the conversation. Just wanted to point those things out. And also this ornamentation here will also be discussed later and what that points to. So, similarly, this is not the third and fourth page. This is actually about 100 folios in. This points to the first quarter of the Qur'an. So if we understand juz, Qur'an being broken into 30ths for recitation during Ramadan. You can also have sabah, it can be broken into 7ths for reading, doing khatam over a week, reading a portion of the Qur'an each day of the week. And then there's even quarters. These major decorative ornamentations in this manuscript are markers of the first quarter of the Qur'an, noting Surah Al-Araf, okay? So these are the ways in which these scribes, these calligraphers, would ornament the Qur'an to notice if you're reciting and you're doing your practice. This is a major marker to know you've made it to this quarter mark of the Qur'an. I'm not going to read this. This is not of particular terrible importance, but it gives you a sense of how you would kind of review a manuscript of this size and give it technical definition and description. So we're not going to spend a ton of time here. I can come back if folks have questions, but this is how this Qur'an would kind of be described by a codicologist or a cataloger, okay? Someone else did this work for this manuscript, but there's one that I've worked on at the University of Toronto that I've done a little bit of that work myself. So this gives you a sense of how it's laid out, its production. I mentioned the time period is from the 19th century or the very early 20th century. And there's ways in which you can identify this even in a manuscript that doesn't have called a colophon, where the person who scribed it doesn't put their name, because that's also another feature of this tradition, is they're all almost entirely anonymous. There's a kind of tradition in this region that the blessings would be less if a scribe wouldn't want to take credit for something that is the book of God. So they would leave them anonymous, and that's a characteristic trait in this region. So the second manuscript, this one I stumbled upon just in the past year. And it was not improperly, the bibliographer at our library doesn't have training in this area, so they thought it was from North Africa. But if you saw the ornamentation of the previous Qur'an, the first thing I should say is it's not a complete Qur'an. It's a partial component of the Qur'an, not even a full seventh. No, I think it's a little bit, it's between a seventh and a quarter of the Qur'an, but it also has other materials gathered with it. Because it's loose, a scholar or a student can keep other things with the Qur'an that have sacred value. So that's what you'll find in this manuscript. Those boards that you saw on the covers, they're wooden boards. So we went to the Cambridge Library. We saw some really old manuscripts that had wooden board covers. Well, these are wooden board covers, likely from some type of tree in the region. And you'll notice the decoration here is similar. So this is actually also one from a similar region in West Africa. And this is one that was, I guess I helped identify to its proper region in Central West Africa. These markers here, you'll find them also as indicators of fifths, tenths, or excuse me, every 5 ayat, 10 ayat, or verses of the Qur'an. And these are different indicators as well. This would indicate the first quarter, the one I showed you before. The first quarter in the sense that they're saying the beginning of the Qur'an is the first quarter. and the other decorations would be for the 4th. And I mentioned how also there are indicators for when you arrive at a 7th of the Qur'an. I'm pretty sure, because you see here where it says Sabah up here, this is indicating that this manuscript has, like I said, between a 7th and a quarter of the Qur'an, but it's not complete. What is with it are things like this. I'm calling them extra Quranic materials because there's a lot, and I haven't identified everything yet. But there's diagrammatic forms like you're seeing here. And the thing I would say, just to kind of give a summary version of what these may represent, some of them are prayers or dua. Some of them also represent, you can call it pharmacology, where there's recipes that people are including along with the prayers that will go along with it. So they're describing local materials, and they're also using what is the relevant ayat from Qur'an to do something that maybe have health benefit in this region. So it's kind of a combination of local medicine and pharmacology, but also what would be the divine or in a way, ruqya that might connect with it in this context. So it's worth keeping in mind that those who are training this, there's the devotional aspect of the Qur'an. There's also the applied skill. If someone has a need, health, or something in their life, they're going to go to someone that is learning in this tradition. This is an example of that. What else can we find? So even the paper itself has clues that can reveal things. So oftentimes when people think of the African continent, they think of this place as isolated from the rest of the world, that trade isn't necessarily going on in the same ways as other parts of the world. Well, there was local paper. There's also local materials for the students that would use wood tablets to write and do their lessons. But for paper has value, it's manufactured, and there was a very lively trade with Italy and parts of Europe for paper that was manufactured there. So this here is a watermark from a paper maker that used to be located in North Africa that later moved to the United Kingdom. You can see here it says Benyamino Arbib, and then here it says Yanasi, which means like old fortune. This was a paper maker, paper distributor out of North Africa. The person's name was Benyamino Arbib. At the top, this was an Italian paper maker, Galvani, and they were one of the most prolific to trade with West Africa. And this idea that paper was one of the things that was traded. So this idea of it just being slaves or gold, there was a whole economy built around scholarship, around the trade of physical materials, and tragically, of course, bodies. But it's also worth noting there's this interconnected economy that you can even see in the manuscripts. And these are pages from the ones that you saw. You can probably notice that that's the first page of that previous manuscript. So another working description. So I wanted to just kind of begin by introducing you all to these manuscripts to give you a sense of what are we working with. So that's a bit of the backstory of these manuscripts. So how did we get, so those manuscripts that are located in this region in West Africa, which I'm going to show you all now, how do we get from here? This is the region, Lake Chad used to be a much larger lake, it's much smaller now. They originate somewhere in this region, and now we find them here. So this is here. So this is where I'm from, right, Detroit, but I'm now at the University of Toronto. The first manuscript, this is the University of Michigan, their library, and then this is the one in Toronto. So how did those manuscripts get from the place I showed you to here? And we saw some of the manuscripts here, and some of the stories are in the descriptions. It's a complex, ambiguous, and not always the most uplifting history when you think about how they get here. The first thing I'll say is the answer to these two manuscripts, I don't know fully. A part of it is mysterious, but we have some ideas, right? So, if we're gonna do the backstory, we have to understand, well, how did this manuscript tradition start? This is gonna be a speed history of Islam in Africa. It's not going to be in detail, but to give you a context of how did this kind of rich manuscript tradition emerge, and how did it end up in these kind of seemingly random collections in North America. And to be honest with you, if I spent some time looking through the catalog and doing search terms here, I could probably find a few of them in this collection as well, but they might be also miscatalogued That's something to keep in mind when we're doing this research on these traditions because they're not always recognized. So some of you may be familiar with this kind of expansion and introduction of Islam in Africa. And a brief version of what I would say is this. In the north, much of that was conquest, but as you can see in this kind of narration here, most of this region from the Sahel, which is the kind of the borderland with the desert, to the south was introduced by trade. There were traders of various denominations or communities, Ibadi, Shia, Sunni, that traded with the empires that were not yet Islamized to the south. They brought influence, they brought skills, they brought knowledge, and they brought Islam. And some of the rulers here then took up Islam themselves, and then eventually their kingdoms became Islamized. So that's just kind of gives you a very high-level overview of the introduction of Islam in this region. So if you think of the context of these manuscripts, again, they're coming from this region here, and this is actually, in fact, perhaps the oldest region because there's reports, there's an oasis in the middle of the desert in Kawar, where Uqba Nafi, if you know, he was the one who conquered in Tunisia. His army went to that oasis, and just below that was where you have the oldest Islamic poly in West Africa. Would have been from the 7th century, where it was introduced, and the dynasties that ruled continued until 1893. So it's about 1,100 years, 2 dynasties changed for this region here. So it's been there for a long time. And this is again the empire I mentioned. This is the region, this is the center, and their influence extended throughout this area. This is the area where those manuscript traditions will come from. So and when I said this would be a quick overview, it's to kind of give you the overview of the context. So some of us may have heard of the Mali Empire, Mansa Musa, the gold trade across West Africa. These are all very close to each other, so these regions are near and they're close. So it's worth keeping in mind that this is an interconnected set of regions. You have rivers that connect this area here, and then Lake Chad, as you can see in the map, to the east, they're interconnected in various forms of trade. A bit later, you have a larger empire, Songhai, that emerges, also an Islamic empire. And then as we get into the area of the transatlantic slave trade and the beginnings of the colonial period, you have revolutions that go across the region. And a part of it is in response to the local movements and how they responded to the advancement and encroachment of slavery. And so some of these movements, if you've heard of the Caliphate of Sokoto, you've heard of any of the Futa in West Africa, this is when they emerged in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So this is all interconnected, as I mentioned. So the manuscript that I opened up with comes from an ancient tradition. The oldest dated Qur'an in West Africa, this is it. Obviously the Qur'an existed in that region much earlier, but if any of you are familiar with how manuscripts are preserved, in regions where things are more tropical and it's not as dry, stuff doesn't last as long. So while this is a Qur'an from the 17th century and it's dated to that period, the extensiveness of the literature and the scholarship and the level of literacy here, according to other researchers, indicates that this is something that had at least 300 years of tradition just based on this text here. So what you're seeing is, this is Surah Al-Fatiha, the opening surah of the Quran, but it has extensive, as you can see, annotations. Those annotations are not only in Arabic, right? This is also in Kanembu, or Old Kanuri, which is a language of the region where they specifically had a language developed for translating from Arabic to the people who would give sermons and khutbahs, and then they would translate it to the local language. It was an intermediary language. If you think of like Latin, it would be kind of like vulgar Latin between like the more classical form. And there's other examples as well. So this gives you a sense of the level of scholarship that was going on this long ago in the region. And so when people say that Africa is a place without history, without books, I think this is the clear proof that disputes that. Similarly, this is from a later period, and you're getting more evidence of how this manuscript tradition exists in the region. This is what just to show you that here. And you see the parallel in the the visual aesthetic between these different manuscripts. So the thing that I mentioned, the tragic aspect. So these books and these people, these scholars and sometimes these lay persons, they're also in motion, oftentimes for learning, for trade, and also for tragic reasons. Transatlantic slave trade had a great impact on West Africa and Central Africa. Wars between states, and then the predatory behaviors of European states and their companies led to the mass movement, not by choice, the forced migration of millions across the Atlantic. And so this gives you the context of how some of these things moved. Now, these manuscripts themselves, the ones that I showed you at the beginning did not come in that way, but there are some that actually did travel in that way. You had some scholars, we'll see one later, they didn't bring the physical books with themselves, but they brought their memorization of it, and they reconstituted manuscripts in the Americas, and you have evidence of those as well. And we'll see a small piece of one of those. The last piece, this movement is interconnected. It's across regions. It also is across the desert, right? We saw that earlier, but it also is going on throughout this period. And this also is what leads to and opens up European interest in the continent. They see this lucrative trade that continues. Gold is on the mind, and also the lucrativeness of enslavement. And also I mentioned Lake Chad. You see how big it is here on the map? Today it's less than 90% of that because of climate change, desertification. But it gives you a sense that this was an important site, and this is the region where a lot of this scholarship has come from. So this is how things change rather quickly. So when I talked about how did we get here, how do these manuscripts end up in Toronto, in Ann Arbor, how do they end up in these places? Well, when you go from 50 years, less than 50 years before, independent kingdoms all across the continent, except for South Africa and Algeria, all independent. Less than 50 years later, there's only 2 places on the continent that have their independence. So when you have armies that come and conquer, destruction of or capturing of knowledge, movement of bodies is one of the priorities to destabilize and to insert in regimes. So this is a part of the picture of where you get this movement of manuscripts, oftentimes not by choice. To be fair to the folks that brought some of them across, sometimes it's I meet a scholar and I pay them some money and I take the manuscript and they bring it with them as well. Sometimes that's the case, so it's a bit of both. But there is a power imbalance when the person that has the money is representative of the colonial regime. So that was a bit of the backstory. It was a bit of a lightning history of the context, but I wanted to give you all, how are these books ending up in these places? How are these manuscripts ending up here? So what did I mean by the book people? So I mentioned earlier, it's a bit of a rendition on people of the book, Ahlul Kitab. This idea of those who carry some of the book. And I use it for 2 reasons. The first would be, it identifies the fact that some of those who moved by force to the New World, they gravitated to a book that they learned about in the African continent. The Injil and the Torah, those are books that are mentioned in the Qur'an. As for a scholar that learns it, if the only book you have access to is the Bible, then you're going to gravitate. And you even find that some of the manuscripts that are written in the Americas are actually written on the pages of missionary texts. In the late 18th century, when he was a young scholar, he lived for a long time, but he lived his last, I think, 60 years in North Carolina. And this was not written in West Africa. This was written during his time in North Carolina. And a part of it is, I think this is part of it, Surat al-Mulk. So one of the surahs of Qur'an about sovereignty and who has proper sovereignty over human beings, even though he was enslaved. And if you notice, if you know anything about the Civil War in the United States and emancipation, didn't fully happen until 1865. So he just missed freedom in the American South. But he did leave a legacy. So that's one example. Another, so this gentleman here, born Muhammad ibn Sa'id, was later under coercion baptized when he was in the service of a Russian czar, a Russian prince rather, and went on this This is a much longer story and a fascinating one for another time. Amazing Odyssey from the Lake Chad region that I've talked about, where this manuscript comes from, through Libya to Turkey, to the Hajj, but not as he was a believer, but was not able to do the rites because he was enslaved, and then to Russia, and then on this amazing journey across Europe, then to the United States, enlisted in the Union Army and fought in the Civil War. It's an amazing story. What's even more amazing is what he says when he arrives in North America about his learning as a child. So I won't read it. If you want me to read it, I can, but I want you all to have a sense of how he describes his learning in the context of the manuscript that I showed you all in the beginning, because they actually almost overlap perfectly. I think he's a little bit older than the manuscript that I showed, but this is the context in which he learned. I will read the bolded parts because those are the key pieces. So he describes being the ninth child of his mother. All my brothers were well educated in Arabic and Turkish. And the next bold part I'll read is, after my father's death, his father was a major general for this, the Kanem-Bornu, the empire I mentioned. I was given to a teacher to be instructed in my native tongue, which would have been Kanuri. One of the languages that I mentioned was in that text, and also in Arabic. In the space of 3 years, I could read and write both languages. And so in that period, he gained his understanding of both his language in written form and also of the Qur'an, understanding it in Arabic. So you're getting a sense of his learning and his education in that region from his time in the United States, reflecting back. And this person, he knew, I think it was like 7 or 8 languages. He learned Italian, he learned French, he learned a little bit of Russian, Arabic. I don't know if he had Turkish or not, and Kanuri. So yeah, the learning there was pretty intensive. Another figure from a nearby region, if you know of the country of Benin in West Africa, this gentleman was from the northern part of that country. And he also describes his education. So when I mentioned earlier those wooden tablets, he is now describing that experience as a child learning. Now he wasn't as studious of a student as you can see here. This is not written in his voice, this is written by, it's an autobiography, but it was kind of written by the person who was his patron. So he wasn't a studious student, but he still learned in this method. So when he says the Africans having neither books nor papers, this is a good example of what I described that clearly was not true. But a board called a wala, the proper Arabic term would be the law, right? This is the idea of the tablet, and in West Africa, the tablet is represented. And this is also true in other regions, I think in parts of East Africa as well. It's the wooden tablet that students use to learn their primary Quranic education. And it's written with local ingredients, often like some form of charcoal and others, and they can use water to rinse it off, to redo and practice their Qur'an. This is what he's describing. So when I say who are these people, I want to give you all a sense of how did these manuscripts be produced, because this isn't oh, they went from orality to manuscript to print. This is a living tradition that still continues in West Africa today. And it's a very revered and honored tradition. So we're not going to do the full documentary, but I want to give you all a sense of about 5 minutes of it so you can have a sense of what this tradition really is. Okay. Hope the audio works.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ألف لام ميم. ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين الذين يؤمنون بالغيب ويقيمون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون والذين يؤمنون بما أنزل إليك وما أنزل من قبلك وبالآخرة هم يوقنون أولئك على هدى من ربهم وأولئك هم المفلحون.
So what will seem like an ancient tradition that's frozen in time, in just a moment we'll see, is in fact, oh, I should have left it alone.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألف لام ميم that.
Give me 1 second, I think I was trying to skip ahead and I sent us backwards. This will work just for this moment, just to get us where we need to be.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم.
Okay. So to give you a visual and audio, oral sense of this place, this is why we're here. What I was trying to say was, it's a living, like a still living tradition, and I want us to be able to get a chance to see it in its vibrancy. Okay. So this is the language I mentioned. All these intertextual glosses are mostly in Hokanembu. Yep. Okay. This is good. Ask forgiveness for the. So I mentioned the law. This is it here. These are students doing their daily lesson and then more. So we're going to do about 2 or 3 more minutes, but this calligrapher shows you some of what he does and he describes some of it. And this region of Nigeria, unfortunately, is more known today for Boko Haram, but this would be the context of, this is completely the opposite of that. This idea of knowledge being forbidden, and seeing the stark opposite of what is actually the norm in this region. Trying to skip to this point, but I'll just leave it alone now so we don't have any more issues. See over here, this is one of the manuscripts that he's So you're getting a sense of the divisions I described and how the calligrapher indicates them.
Ali alhamdulillah to ga shi dan jami'a Ali da ina da sina da full stop Ali sunan da zai shi uskun da shi ma idan kwallo
So I'll stop here just for the sake of time. He goes on later to describe that it takes, for someone as skilled as him, he could do a Qur'an if he's being pressed for time, he could do it in 2 months. Like write it out by hand, yeah. But that the typical time is 3 months, 2.5 to 3 months. And he knows the exact number of, they get these big folios of paper and they fold them and cut them themselves, and he knows the exact amount is between 3 and 4 groupings that he knows he has to buy. He says he can do this in less, and then he knows the exact routine, and this is his trade, this is his craft, and he does this on a regular basis. So this is what I mean when I say this is a living tradition. And this is the region where people go from other parts of West Africa to learn these traditions. Okay. Now we can go back to the. Okay. So those are the people, right? I wanted to humanize these manuscripts because sometimes when we think about the manuscripts, it's kind of like just the text, but the text has a person behind it. They always have. The book, the Qur'an itself. What can we see here? So this will focus more on what are the interpretations and insights that we can pick up from the scribal traditions, the calligraphers, and also what they may be conveying to us from the interpretive traditions of the region. Because what manuscripts can do that a printed text can't do is, if it's a local tradition, whatever glosses or paratext, things that are around the text that may be the notes of the scribe or the student or the scholar are going to be localized to that place. The Qur'an will be the same. There may be a different riwayat, it may be warsh, it may be hafs, but the notations around it that give it context will be unique to that place. And that's a part of what we can see here. So I mentioned earlier this idea that the manuscript that kind of inspired me in some ways, how it's Surah Fatih al-Kitab, as opposed to just being al-Fatih. It's a small difference, but if you were to look, there's another researcher that actually did a comparison of manuscripts from this region, and that is the overwhelming norm for the title for Surah Fatih, is Fatih al-Kitab, the opening of the book. So it shows that this place that's been Islamic for over 1,000 years, it represents the way in which each place localizes the tradition. The manuscript text itself, the Qur'an, is the same. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. What you see in terms of the voweling, which became standardized in around the 10th, not the voweling. Yeah, so you're getting a sense of how the earliest versions of the Qur'an and the transmitters of it, you have the same consonantal text, the same body of the text, but you have the different recitations that become prominent in different regions, and you also have different even ways of seeing interpretation through the titles of surahs, because those weren't fixed until a later period in different places. And they aren't necessarily fixed now. There are books, some that come out of Egypt, that are printed that say, hey, Surah Fatih has 10 different names. We've heard it referred to as Al-Hamd, as the 7 oft-recited verses. There's various names for it, and you see them in the manuscript text. So that's one example. And I have this example here to show you what's more commonly seen, right? And they're available online based on the. So these are indications that show the most widely practiced recitation method or riwayat of the Qur'an. Hafs is the one that's most common worldwide, and it's the one that you find most frequently represented in printed Qur'ans. But Warsh from Morocco, Tunisia, I think for most of the African continent, with the exception of Egypt, Warsh is the main recitational style. It's minor differences, but you see some of those minor differences that don't have a substantive change to meaning, but the voweling is different. So for example, in Fatiha, instead of Maliki Yawmiddin, it's Maliki Yawmiddin, which minor translation difference would give you King of the Day of Judgment versus Owner of the Day of Judgment. It's not a substantive change in meaning, but it is a slight one. And so it just shows that the different methods, these reciters, Waters and Hafs, they're coming from the first generations. They're just reciting in the ways in which this variation is considered acceptable. The connection here to the kind of stylistic connection that I mentioned earlier. This is a representation of how you can see visual elements of a manuscript that can connect you to a place. So even if you didn't have knowledge of Arabic, and like me, you can't read Old Kanembu, you can make a connection to these coming from the same region based on the visual aesthetic and the decoration of the manuscripts. And I mentioned before, this empire was a very long-lasting one in that region. Another example, so Surah Abasa. In this manuscript tradition, the title for Surah Abasa is actually less focused on the frowning that most interpreters consider to be the Prophet frowning at the blind man and being rebuked by God for that. The title in this tradition actually focuses on the blind man. So the title is Surah Al-Anma in this tradition. So it's a slight difference. Doesn't affect the meaning of the verses itself, but it could indicate if someone is interpreting what they might emphasize. There might be an emphasis on how would you engage or treat this blind man who wants knowledge from the messenger of God, versus on this rebuking of the messenger for frowning. So that's a potential interpretation. I'm not saying it's the one that existed or is the only one. And you can see in these ones, Abasa, and Alam. And I guess the last thing I should add is you see also the difference in the scribal hand, the way in which the script is written. I think it was shown in one of the earlier slides. It's considered to be the Sudani or Barnawi hand, where it's slightly different. Like Qaf has one dot above instead of two, and Fa instead of one dot above, it's below. Just minor differences in the last letters of Arabic letters are different. So like when there's a yeah, that one look like this here, and the noon are hard to distinguish in this script. Okay, finally, so this is what I just described. So this is the same translation we would have. He frowned and turned away, that the blind man came to him. And so this just gives you a sense of the meaning is the same. That's the important part to emphasize. And that you can get a sense of what might be stressed in the interpretive tradition based on even surah titles. Okay. So then this is where I'll kind of stop. There's a part for Q&A, but I wanted to kind of open it up to kind of some like discussion and discourse. So then how might these scholars use their skills? How are we doing on time? Yeah. What do we think? And this is them question and a now question. As we saw, this is a living tradition. I'm talking about the scribal skills, what I mentioned. Actually, that's at the end. Yeah, so what are our thoughts? Some of these, let's think of the scribes themselves, but also what I showed earlier about we saw the extra Quranic material, where the scholar clearly had a Qur'an, part of it, but also a gathering of other materials that are related to the Qur'an. So how might a scholar in this tradition today or previously, how might they use these skills in their communities? What do you think?
Acting maybe as a judge in the local rituals.
For sure, yeah. Especially in places where there's not established book culture, to have a consistency of legal judgments or tradition. I completely agree. Others?
As teachers.
Absolutely.
As teaching, understanding, and meaning.
Yeah, and ironically to that point, you saw the assistant there, the Malam Tahir Abba in that one video. The name Malam actually means teacher, and I mean in Arabic, but that's like the Hausa, Arabized Hausa version of Malam for Northern Nigeria. So you've been seeing that there. You saw the Goni, who was the scribe, who was a master teacher, and the assistant that was a part of the documentary was also a teacher there. So that's a great example. Any others?
You might think of the patterns inscribed in the Qur'an. So they obviously understand the beauty of Allah's words, so they attempt to display that and maybe decorate
I think that's a really rich one because I'm thinking of, yeah, if a child is spending, one thing I wanted to add, I didn't have time. They start, those that do this, they start at 3 a.m. They take a break. They go from 3 a.m. to 7:30 a.m. with their teacher. They take a break, but the break is to go and memorize more from 7 to 10. No, seriously. The break is like to be away from the group. And then I think they take a short break during the day, and then they go back at 3 p.m. They continue until 7, and then they continue until 10. So they end up having like 14-hour days, and they do this consistently. So this is like so if you're going to spend that much time, you want there to be an aesthetic dimension that's connected to the divine. So I would. Any other thoughts? So yeah, I would completely agree with all of those. And this is one of the things I wanted to add that kind of adds to the thing I mentioned about the manuscript that was a partial Qur'an but had other material. This is how they used it. There's even a name that's going to be on the next slide for that kind of manuscript. So while the scribe was a goni, like as a master scribe, a gardi would be an even higher master scholar that can do that, but also has knowledge of the different virtues, which some of these sections might point to, and some of the special therapeutic or apotropaic uses of the Qur'an. And just to be clear, this is, a lot of times this is considered to be, it's magic, it's superstition. I think as I mentioned earlier, it's important to keep in mind, they're thinking of the special therapeutic values, but they're also drawing on varieties of recipes by local scholars. When I say recipes, if you're thinking of like botany and pharmacology, there's local elements, plants, things that you're connecting with your spiritual care. So this is not unlike what has become a revolutionary thing today. It's like, oh, connect the spiritual with the medicine. Well, this is what this is what they were doing. This is what they're still doing. It's the idea of translating between these different traditions that probably needs to be better done. And the manuscript that I described earlier that was Quranic material and extra Quranic material, it has a name. It's called a kundi. So it's where a person who might be, in a way, a healer, but also a scholar of the Qur'an, he would have his notebook that would have his Quranic material that he may be using. And in addition to that, the other materials that may collect some of that other knowledge that may be beneficial to those he's trying to he or she should say. And just as further, these are some other, from that same one I just showed you earlier, these are other sections of it that are extra Quranic. Just a quick one I'll point out. This is one of the tables that has, this one I don't know what the meaning is here particularly. This one, if you're seeing it, this is actually Surah Fatiha, and they've taken some of the letters and made them a little bit bigger, and they've put the names of angels and prophets in the spaces. And then you have La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah al-azim. So they have it repeated a few times. So this clearly has a power of prayer that the person is trying to convey and potentially use in aid of others or for oneself. So, yeah, I guess to close, what else can we learn? It's more of it's a rhetorical question at this point. We can have it in the Q&A if it's helpful. But some of the things that have been pushing and motivating me, or some of my thinking, it's quite a few questions. I'm a researcher still. It's things like this. The facts that the scribes are anonymous, it's an amazing thing in terms of the barakah for the scribes, but it is a challenge for a researcher because it's hard to describe it to someone. You don't have dates. So how do you get dates? Well, you have to use watermarks, so you can say, oh, okay, well, this Italian papermaker was from this period to this period, so I know this can only be this old. When was it transmitted? Well, this is the part that's going to be exciting for me, since these scholars are so humble, they're not going to just get on a loud horn and say, look at me. You have to go to them, you have to show respect, you have to sit and you have to learn. So we'll probably, inshallah, in the next year, I'll be sitting down like those gentlemen were and getting some knowledge as well from some of these scholars. Yeah, that's the last part. Yeah, what can you learn in the field? And there's some things that are just unknowable. There's often this idea that the older the manuscript, the better the knowledge, or it's more valuable. Well, if folks are still producing and they're recreating and they're not spending as much time maintaining the older manuscripts, that might tell us something about what the tradition is trying to tell us. Maybe this idea of over-veneration for old manuscripts is something that may be coming from somewhere else. Because if we look, as amazing as it is to see manuscripts behind glass cases, who actually is able to read that if it's only one page a day? These ones are getting used. Y'all saw the one that was all, the pages were all torn up, the edges. The ones that don't get used is because somebody took it and put it in the University of Michigan Library or University of Toronto. So there's something to this, like, the fascinating aspect of an old text, but also the fact that the ones that get used and go away have their purpose. So that's the things I wanted to, oh, and I almost forgot. What gets missed? The Qur'an is an oral text, first and foremost. Like, that's something that I feel like it's so often forgotten with these manuscripts. It's not a written text. It wasn't first a written text. All of those vowels, the fact that there's an allowance for other recitations isn't based on it being written in different ways. It's based on there being an affordance for different types of oral recitation. So that's one thing to definitely keep in mind, that there's only so much that the manuscript can tell. And overly speculating in the manuscript and not relying on what the oral tradition says is something that we should be wary of. And so with that, thank you all for indulging me. We'd love to open this up now to comments and questions. I hope this was beneficial.